strategy. It was around April, late April, early May. And I'll start by discussing the notion of a nudge. A nudge is a very important concept in behavioral economics, and it's contains the idea of inducing somebody to do the right thing. The right thing could be the right thing for the person or the right thing for society by means of psychological manipulation. Okay, if I give you a very famous example about organ donation and you look at this graph, you'll notice countries that are very similar. For instance, Denmark and Sweden. This is the proportion of people that agree to donate organ in their driving license. And what you see is an amazing difference in quantities. And what people found out is this difference is only attributed to the default. Okay, in these countries, the default is that if you don't sign, you agree to donate. Here, if you don't sign, you don't agree to donate. So people are sticking to the default, and this is an example of a nudge. Okay, so in order to get you to do something, we have to incorporate this thing into a default. That's one example. There are lots of other examples. A very famous one is a social nudge, where we try to convince people to do something by referring to similar people who have done the same thing. So, for instance, the electricity company in California, when it wanted to reduce consumption of electricity in the state, they sent letter to individual referring to the fact that other people are consuming much less energy than you. And this turned out to be an effective tool to reduce people's consumption as well. Okay, I want to start my talk by quoting Johnson's speech on May 10, when he was actually announcing the exit strategy. Okay, and with this quote to highlight the difference between the approach to dealing with COVID-19 in the UK and in the rest of Europe, also in Israel, and many other countries, okay? The policy in the UK and during Trump time in the US as well was excessively liberal. And this is one of the issues that I want to raise during this talk. And here is what Johnson said. He said the following, and the first step is a change of emphasis that we hope that people will act on this week. We said, namely in the past when we announced the lockdown, we said that you should work from home if you can and only go to work if you must. So we never told you not to leave home. We never told you not to go to work. We recommended that if you can work from home, you work from home, okay? Otherwise, go to work. Now we say, we now need to stress that anyone who can't work from home, for instance, those in construction or manufacturing, should be actively encouraged to go to work, okay? So now what he's saying, okay, move your ass out of your seat and go out, okay? This is very, very different. So nothing, hardly anything was done mandatorily. Almost all the guidelines were voluntary. And I'm going to raise a question as I move on, whether this is a wise way to proceed, or whether is a correct way to deal, okay, with the matter. So the British extremely liberal approach dealing with COVID-19 has several reasons. One of them is culture. Britain is a liberal country. It has a liberal culture with a long history of liberalism. But there are more than that. There is more than that. The UK government has a long tradition listening to behavioral scientists. This started with Prime Minister Cameron, where he wanted, we actually was a policy to replace regulation with nudging. Just the idea was, let's not force firms and people to do things. Let's just try to slightly use psychology in way of changing their behavior. Okay, he formed the famous behavioral insight team that was led by David Halperin. And David Halperin, which I met, and he's a nice and smart guy, but he's really biased in way of what should be done. He was overemphasizing or pushing very hard towards this liberal approach of not using any restriction, but rather use nudging. He was emphasizing the idea on herd immunity, which by now we know is a total bullshit. And he was also talking about behavioral fatigue. He told people and government officials, you know, if you put people in a lockdown, they will manage to stay at home for 2 days, and then, you know, no matter what you do, they will live. Okay. He was then opposed by a bunch of behavioral economists that, like me, I wasn't part of this letter, but like me, thought that more restrictive tools need to be used. Okay. So at this stage, when I recognize it, I decided most of my effort is to exert on trying to convince the government on a more restrictive approach. We now see it a little bit more. I'm allowing myself to be under the illusion that one of the slightly harder approach that we see today is part of these, is an outcome of the huge effort that I put to talking with these people. But one of the things that I was trying to explore, one of the examples that I gave them is the following. I told them, just imagine what would have happened if we replaced traffic laws with nudges. Okay, that means we dismantle all speed cameras. Okay, we made red light stopping totally voluntary. We recommend that if you cross the street on red light or drive through a junction in red light, you be a little bit cautious, but it's up to you. I mean, you're a grown person. You can either stop at red light or continue to drive. Okay, so that's the policy. We dissolve the traffic policies, no fines, no sanctions, nothing. Okay, no traffic courts, nothing. And instead, we install list of recommendation for safe driving, okay? And nudges, of course. So we can, of course, keep the light, and instead of forcing people to stop in red light, we put these small signs on lights saying most drivers stop at red here in this junction, okay? If you feel that it's really ridiculous, then I guess you understood the point, right? This would not have worked out. Okay, this would have led to enormous number of casualties. Okay, this is something that cannot work. Okay, so let's shift from driving to something else, smoking. Okay, we don't force people not to smoke. Okay, we allow people to smoke, but we have other hard policies to reduce smoking. For instance, taxation. We have lots of soft policies to induce people to smoke less, okay, which is, for instance, warning on cigarette packages and stuff like that, advertisement on TV and media about the risk of smoking. These are the soft policies. Which of them is more effective? There's a clear answer to these questions. The International Tobacco Control Policy Evaluation Project says that taxation, recall, taxation is the hard policy, is like a fine. Taxing people for smoking is like giving them a fine for smoking. Taxation is the most effective tobacco control method, okay? Now, Now let's think about it. What do we have in common between COVID, driving, and smoking? Okay, and here is the answer. In the three activities, irresponsible behavior generates substantial risk to oneself, but not only to oneself, also to others. And this is important. We economists call it negative externalities. Okay? One would thought, okay, that if it causes risk to you, for instance, driving uncarefully would cause risk to you, then the threat or the fear of being involved in a car accident and losing your life will be a sufficient incentive for you to drive correctly. This is nonsense, okay? This is nonsense because we see more violation of traffic rules when police is not around, okay? The risk of being involved in a car accident, of getting cancer because of smoking, or getting infected with the COVID if we're not keeping the rules, these risks are too abstract. They're too remote. We perceive them as totally theoretical. The cap around the corner is much more concrete. We fear the cop. Paradoxically, the cop is a greater incentive for us to act properly than this abstract incentive of getting a huge punishment, okay? Now, I was compelled to approach the people at the cabinet office, or I compelled myself, I would say, to come up with criteria, okay? This is something that they could use, beyond COVID-19 story, about when would you allow yourself, when should you allow yourself to use nudging and behavioral tools without restrictive or mandatory restrictions, okay? And I came up with these three conditions, okay? Soft policies are adequate if and only if at least one of the following conditions applies. Let me state these conditions. One of them is that the stakes are not too high, okay? The second condition is that the externality effect, the negative spillover, are negligible. They're not large, okay? And the third condition is that the alternative of hard policies, okay, the alternative, the hard policies that we are considering to replace the soft policy present severe human rights violation, okay? What I suggested is that if the situation is such that one of these three conditions, I don't require the three of them to be satisfied simultaneously. I just require at least one of them to apply in order to make the option of behavioral nudging as the only tool feasible or adequate, I would say, okay? Let me give a few examples. Organ donation. Organ donation is a case where three applies, but not the other. The alternative of hard policies to impose is a severe human right violation. If we mandatorily tell people you have your organs would be donated no matter what you say, okay? This would present to many people, especially religious people, a very severe violation of human rights, okay? Still, the two others don't apply, right? The stakes are high because it's life and death. And the externality is huge because if you don't donate organs, somebody will die eventually, okay? Let's take another example. Nudging for reducing energy consumption, like the story about California electricity company, okay? In this case, we have, there are externalities. The 3 doesn't apply. I mean, we can't tell people you're forced to consume not more than such. It's very non-liberal, but the stakes are not so high, so we can use nudging here, okay? Finally, the third example that I want to make is nudging, for instance, nudging men above 50 to test for colon cancer, okay? We can't force people to do the testing. Again, it's a violation of, maybe it's not a violation. Maybe we can force them. I'm not sure about 3, but what I'm sure about is that the stakes are high, but there's no externality. It's your own health, okay? And if there is no externalities, you know, mandatory regulations are not necessary. It's your own decision, okay? So these are the 3 conditions that I was suggesting. Now, if Renaud will allow me, how much time do I have, Renaud?
Yeah, you have all the time you want to take, but let's say 5-6 minutes is good.
Yeah, I'll just survey some of the questions that I was posed. When this consulting program started, I formed a small team of behavioral economists, including Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman. There were questions that I knew I have a good answer and was clear. More tricky ones, we organized discussions and we came up with some ideas about what to say. Here are some of the issues that were raised. One important thing was issue that we call the negative attribution theory, okay? When people are in lockdown and they see other people leaving home, okay, their incentive to remain under lockdown decline tremendously. One of the reasons is that they always interpret other people leaving home as people violating regulation, okay? But very often these people who are on the street need to be on the street because they are emergency teams, okay? And the question was how to convey to individuals that if they see people on the street, these are not necessarily people who violate the law, okay? We used the campaign in which British people thanked the health stuff in hospitals as an opportunity to also deliver this message. Okay, while they were thanking nurses and doctors and sanitary personnel in hospitals, they were also told that these people might be on the street because they need to be on the street. How do we deal with severe? I will not have time to discuss all the answers that we have. One question was how to deal with severe obedience. So there are people who were abused by other people who want to take advantage of the fear and anxiety that people had. Okay, so we're calling, for instance, people who were calling elderly people and saying, we are from the Social Security Office, you are entitled for an additional 100 pound allowance for this month. Give me your bank details and I'm going to transfer the money to you, okay? We were dealing with questions of how to encourage people who were sick, not with COVID-19, but with other diseases, people who suffer from cancer, from heart diseases, etc., not to give up their treatment and do go to the hospital. And this is more important than the risk of being infected in COVID-19, that they should get the treatment, okay? So encouraging people that need to be out, need to go to the hospital to do it. How does the lockdown itself affect mental health and violence? But by the time I was consulting the cabinet office, there were already data coming out in Israel from the lockdown in Israel, because here in Israel we started much earlier than in the UK, and there was a clear evidence on rising violence and mental health problem due to the lockdown. And this was also an issue, and one of the critical questions that the cabinet office was dealing with is the pubs. Pubs, I was told, in the UK are very similar to synagogues in Israel. It's like the religious shrine of the British people. Okay, it's not only a place to meet. It's a place where for many people the social interaction are built up and maintained, and so it was. Pubs were very high in the priority of opening up, and of course there was an issue because pubs are enormously dangerous environment to be infected. It's very dense. It's closed. It's people are laughing. People are shouting. It's enormously risky. And I came with some ideas about how to open up pubs faster, but more carefully. And one of these ideas that was very much rejected by the associations of pubs. There is an association called the Household Association, namely pub owners. They didn't like the idea. And the next time you go to a pub and you look at the person who is behind the desk serving clients, these are not people you should get problem with, okay? So I started getting some nasty email messages from them. But my idea was that in addition to reducing the amount of time that a guest could stay in the pub, okay, as was done in Germany, that there is also a restriction on the amount of alcohol that is being served, because alcohol keeps people for two reasons. First of all, it will be harder to get people out if they know that they can be served more alcohol. And secondly, the side effect of alcohol and a greater tendency to become violent because of the lockdown could be very dangerous, okay? This was not implemented. There was a lot of discussions. I was interviewed mainly about this, but not only about this, I was asked to write an article for The Sun on pubs and how they should be opened. It was a long interview with The Guardian on this, Mirror, and so forth. I think the one thing there are two things that I think that I hope my service was useful. One of them I'm pretty sure, and this came out also in Johnson's talk, which is one thing I said: in order to have an effective exit strategy, one has to be very precise in terms of the schedule. You don't have to come up with a schedule in terms of dates, but you have to come up with a schedule in terms of outcomes, okay? The reason is, there are two reasons. One of them is that each one of us has its own exit strategy, okay? Has to develop his own exit strategy. I need to know whether I'm going to the barbershop first, or to the university, or to shop this or that, okay? what is the orders of things that I can expect to be doing in the next 2 weeks. The other reason why I thought a very precise schedule is necessary is because the more precise and the more commitment you put into the schedule, the more people are going to believe in it. If you describe the terms in a very vague and amorphous way, people will say, you know, it can change any moment. Let's forget about it. If you give an impression that you know what you're talking about, it becomes much harder for people to disobey the rules. Okay, so this was too important. This was very important. I think this was actually executed by the government. The other thing, and again, this I'm only conjecturing based on what I'm seeing were happening during the second lockdown, is that there was a certain shift from a totally voluntary approach to somewhat more restrictive one. Renaud, I think I'll stop here. If there are questions,
perfect.
I'll be glad to address them.
Thank you so much, Professor Winter, for this very stimulating talk. There have been already quite a few reactions on the site, so please don't hesitate to send more comments and questions through the Q&A. In particular, I would be curious to know that if pubs are like synagogue, what is the alcohol equivalent to? But
you don't drink alcohol in synagogues. That's different.
I will then not ask my stupid questions and take actual questions from the audience. And I think we had quite a few questions about first evidence on soft versus hard measure. And I combined two questions here, but there seem to be people looking at data from the Financial Times about countries having soft rules and hard rules, and then other people wondering whether we can actually make a causal inference about the kind of countries who actually implement soft rules or hard rules. So do we really know if the impact is different?
I think we don't have clear, strict evidence about it, because it's never easy to compare countries. There's also lots of differences in terms of culture, the way people tend to meet each other, the role of family in one culture and another. So these are very different. But I think that overall, you know, if we compare countries in which the rules were restrictives, like Israel, for instance, like New Zealand, like Taiwan, these are really at the top of the list in terms of restrictiveness, but also in terms, they are at the bottom of the list in terms of the number of infections. Okay, so there is a relationship. In Israel, there was indeed a fatigue, a COVID fatigue, in the sense that people were obedient very, very much at the first lockdown, but started to be much loose in the second one, and you could see the number difference. Okay, you could see the number difference. I think now the story is different. I mean, now the emphasis should be not on following rules about social distancing, but rushing to get the vaccine. And this is going to be another issue, non-trivial issue, to get people, especially young people, who observe that they are less in risk of getting a serious illness from the virus. They have less motivation, less incentives to be vaccinated. They have some fears. Some of them are completely irrational. I mean, there are symptoms that there isn't even a slight argument or a slight evidence that it's correct. For instance, some young women are concerned about fertility, okay, if they take the vaccine. There's no basis whatsoever to it, and still people tend to believe in it. So it's going to be a big challenge to convince these people that they should do it for themselves, but also for other people.
I'm sure there will be quite a few other questions on vaccine later, but because you were talking about Brexit, about behavioral fatigue, we have a question here about that, which is, do you think there is a difference between hard and soft policy in terms of how quickly people become fatigued? And linked to that, there was another question about the long-run impact of the policies.
This is an excellent question. I think there is a difference. Because if you look at yourself, if you are a student, okay, for instance, if you know that you have to submit the paper as part of your commitments, as part of the necessary stuff to do in order to pass the course, you will do it. You know, the incentive that is built in will give you energy. Give you, to some extent, at least some of the energy that is necessary in order to be able to do it. If you knew that this paper that you submit is voluntary, you know, it might, you know, depending on the mood of the professor, it may raise your grade, final grade, or may not, okay? You will find it much harder to do, okay? So very often, the incentives that are built in way of encouraging people to do something affect the subjective way their experience, the subjective experience in terms of the difficulty of the task. Namely, the more incentive they have to perform the task, the less they will subjectively experience the task as being difficult. Okay, so this is an argument. This answers your questions, and this is another argument for why mandatory restrictions might work better than nudging in cases like this.
So thanks. We also have a question about the politics of it. Do you have the impression that different segments of the population support hard versus soft policies? And could this explain simply by political cost-benefit analysis by governments why some are more reluctant than others to implement hard policies?
I would say politics and ideology, okay? We do tend to see social democrat governments being more restrictive, and liberal, let's say, conservative right-wing governments being, I would say, less restrictive. I mean, we saw this shift immediately after the new administration in the US took office, okay? One of the first few things that that Biden decided on is making COVID restriction or COVID condition more restriction. This is really unnecessary. I would have liked decisions about COVID not to be based on ideology, to be based on medicine, on science, not on politics and ideology. And the fact that ideology and political considerations that are not ideological, okay, sometimes there's no ideology at all. It's just a fight between two parties that one take one position, the other is taking the opposite position. The fact that politics and ideology kicks in so prominently also make it harder for people to obey the rules, whether they're restrictive, whether they're mandatory, or done through nudges.
So the fact that we perceive it as political is itself part of the problem.
Say again?
The fact that we perceive it as political is already part of the problem.
Politically, when we perceive it as a political issue, then we are telling ourselves, you know, why should I actually do it? Is it really, am I getting the right information? That would be the first question. Yeah. Am I informed correctly? Now, if there is a political issue behind it, then it's very, very likely that the information that I'm getting is biased. And if the information that I'm getting is biased, why should I act upon this information? Okay, so this question pop up, and that just makes us more reluctant to obey the rules.
So a question about advisor, in particular about you. So Cameron is asking, how has your approach with nudges changed over time with technology over your career and government approaches during crisis?
Well, there's a lot of, there has been a lot of attempts in the UK, but also in other countries, in Europe, in Israel, to use nudging through technology. Many firms are doing it. Some of them for good purposes, not necessarily for, if there are firms that are doing these things obviously for profit, but sometimes the causes are good. I mean, let me just mention one firm that I was advising to. That was using nudging through smartphone to warn people about their risk of getting into overdraft and overspending. Okay. Overall, this is a positive. This is a positive cause, and now, because most of our communication are done through the smartphone, much of the nudging business or nudging tools are done through smartphones, through notifications, through warnings, through advices, etc. Did I answer this question, or was?
I think you answer very completely this question. I'm sure Cameron will be delighted. Actually, it was already the second question I picked from Cameron. So you talked a lot about nudges, but little about financial incentives. And when people talk about in the UK, people not self-isolating, what they have in mind a lot is that you don't get enough compensation, etc. So is it about rules being not respected, or is it simply about incentives being wrong in a more classical economics?
It's also an excellent question. How people are compensated and how people are treated to offset at least some of the huge costs that they have to incur because of COVID has an enormous effect on the way they are on their willingness to abide by the rules. Let me mention that I mentioned that people in the pub association were furious about my ideas, but after some time, when they read my article, they understood that this is very much in line of what they are willing to have, and they invited me to a very large webinar to talk about my suggestions of the association with hundreds of pub owners. And one thing I heard, and this is really an issue, is that the concern that pub owner had are not with the current situation. They of course left the pubs. If they rented the place, they canceled or delayed the contract. What they're worried about is what is going to happen when COVID is away, when people are back into business. And one of the concerns is that all these places that, for instance, Joe's Pub used to be a landmark in a small city, okay, will now be taken over by big chain stores. Let's say Wetherspoons or some other.
No, not a Wetherspoon, no.
And they will disappear, and they will disappear. So these people will be driven out of the market even when the market can shoot back, can flourish, right? And this is not only that. There's only also a lot of places that needed to shut down. Some places are allowed to open up, like supermarket, and they started taking businesses from those places that are not allowed to open up. Okay, so they are extracting revenues from people who are not, or from businesses who are not allowed to be open, okay, in favor of businesses who lost nothing from this situation, maybe even made gains, maybe substantial gains from COVID-19. This is an unfair situation. This drives people to say we're not going to, we're going to rebel. We're not going to obey it. And it's the responsibility of the government to set up mechanisms that will prevent this unfairness.
Okay, great, thanks.
There are some ideas, some very simple ideas in this respect.
I think it's important to notice that there are also winners and losers. So I think we have time for two short questions. One by Joseph about the difference with another island, New Zealand. And I think he's concerned about how you would think of exit strategy for a country that went for a zero COVID strategy.
Well, some people tried it and it didn't work out. I think in New Zealand it worked out. Surprisingly, there were also countries that had zero COVID strategy, like for instance Sweden, okay, that decided we hardly do anything, okay, we keep everything open, we continue with our life basically, and maybe unsurprisingly, in terms of the economic price that they paid, it was quite similar to other countries in Europe. And the reason for it is that these days no country is an island, okay? And if people in Sweden continue their life as usual, and they won't, because some people will refrain from going out because they are worried about their own themselves getting infected. But even if they continue with their lives and the rest of the world is shut down, you pay the price. You cannot avoid paying the price unless you are an autarkic market that provide all its needs for itself by itself. That doesn't happen anymore.
That's not England, definitely. So a last question about information. So we try to shorten that. Do you think that non-compliance is high because person-specific risk is not accurately reflected to society or measured accurately enough? So this question suggests that we could use network theory to try to inform people about the number of interactions in society and try to benchmark each other and see that their friends are also seeing each other less. Do you think those kind of information is useful?
It may, as long as it's not overloading individuals, right? Knowing what, when you use nudges, one very important thing about nudges in way of maintaining its effectiveness is that you cannot lie to people, okay? For instance, you cannot tell somebody whom you want to consume less energy that all his neighbors are consuming much less than he does when it's not correct, okay? So what people who apply nudges do, they simply don't go to those people, okay? So people who are, they send correct messages, but they pick up selectively who is going to get these messages, okay? So they look for those people whose consumption are really high. And for these people, it's correct that their neighbors are consuming much less than them, okay? So when you use nudges, you have to be very careful about the amount of information that you are giving. I'll tell you something, some other experience with this respect. For instance, there are experiments that we did here and showed that if you load people with information, there is no monotonicity. You can tell people more and get a worse outcome. Okay,
Okay.
Because concise information is very important.
Okay. Thank you. I think I'm afraid we're running out of time. It was a very interesting discussion. There were even some questions I didn't have time to ask. Thank you so much for your time.
If anyone wants to ask further questions, they are welcome to send me an email.
Very well. And everyone, you are also welcome to rewatch or share this talk if you liked it. It will be in a few days in our YouTube page. In a few weeks, we're going to have 2 additional talks. In 2 weeks, Dr. Konstantinos Vassilopoulos on COVID and housing markets. And then 2 weeks later, Dr. Vincent O'Sullivan on health economics. So again, related to COVID, I think we cannot talk about anything else those days. And this is an event co-organized by the Lancaster Economic Society. And for all the students, they organize in 2 days at 4 p.m. GMT, a talk with Paul McCormick on how to read efficiently the Financial Times. Thank you everyone for joining and for a very lively discussion.
Goodbye, everybody. Keep safe.